I often get comments in my videos from people asking where my riving knife is and where my blade guard is. The riving knife, I know it seems odd, but once upon a time they didn't exist, and this saw was not made for them. All the saws of this generation, I think, were not made for that particular thing. I know that when you're new to woodworking, this is all you see. You see newer tools with this, the safety stuff on there. And it didn't exist back when this saw was made. There was a guard for this saw, but it hooked onto the motor mount on the back here, and it could tilt with the motor mount. But the problem with those guards is that they only cover the blade, and they won't allow you to make a partial cut through a piece of wood. Say if you're cutting a rabbet, you won't be able to do that cut with that guard installed. So if you take off the guard for one cut, you may as well take it off for every cut and just be more careful. That's the best philosophy anyway. It's like if you're walking down a busy street and there's a guardrail on your side there that separates you from the traffic. Well, if the guardrail wasn't there, you obviously wouldn't, walk out into the traffic, would you? No, you'd be a little bit more careful and not do that. And it's the same situation with any tool that can damage you if you do something stupid or lose your focus temporarily. And I think that's the #1 reason for injuries on any power tool. So let's get down here for a closer look. I'll take the throat plate up. I'll show you why this saw won't take a riving knife. It doesn't have any space over here. See the blade? It's almost touching the back casting of this thing that it fits in. Now, it almost looks like this blade is too big for this saw, but it is a 10-inch saw, and it just barely clears that over there. So even if I wanted to have a riving knife on here, I really couldn't put one. Now, there is another possibility, and that's to put something out here that's called a splitter. And that may help, but what I find is really important with learning how to use a tool is to learn how to avoid the situations that'll get you in trouble in the first place. And if you've been using a saw like this for virtually all your life, then you've come to an understanding what it takes to avoid the problems that these splitters or riving knives are supposed to fix. Now, I'm not saying that a riving knife or a splitter is a bad thing. I'm just saying that a riving knife or a splitter is something that I really don't need, because I learned long ago how to avoid situations where if the wood pinches together, it's going to cause kickback. Kickback is something that you're going to experience when you're first starting out using this tool. It's almost unavoidable, but the key is to learn from what happened there to cause the kickback. Usually what happens with kickback, what causes it, is the wood, as you're pushing it through, will start to bend because you're relieving stress as you're making the cut. This usually happens with semi-dry 2x4s and stuff like that. You'll see that. Or it could be really dry, except not super dry. And you run it through the saw and it starts to pinch on the blade at the back. Well, there's a way to avoid that, and there's a way to deal with that when it does happen. The main thing, though, that will prevent a problem is to be aware of what can happen when you're doing that. When I take my piece of 2x4 and I run it into my saw, I know what potentially can happen, and that way I can avoid it, or I can deal with it when it does happen. I'm going to try cutting this piece of 2x4 and see if it'll pinch on the blade. I'm going to do the cut in one pass. The other way, the best way to avoid it, if you know you're working with material that can pinch, is to cut halfway up on the first pass. And that way, once you do that, there's no way it can pinch on the blade. Then flip it over and cut through the rest of the way. One benefit of it is the blade is a lot lower and it has a lot less ability to grab the work and throw it back at you. You'll have more control. The other thing is you can take a small wedge and put it in the cut you already made, and that will absolutely prevent it from closing together. So anyway, I'm going to try to cut this. I'm going to raise the blade up so it's just clearing the work. any higher is kind of stupid, as we covered earlier in another video. Okay, that really didn't grab. It did a little bit at the first of the second cut that I made. Whenever I'm ripping a 2x4 like this, I will always cut in part way, and then I'll flip it over and finish the cut rather than trying to push the whole thing through with a push stick or whatever. The problem is you have way too much stock hanging over the end of your table saw. Even if you have an outfeed table, it's still a lot safer and better to do what I did, and that's pick it up. But anyway, it did start to pinch a little bit there, and it did burn. One thing that you can do with a saw like this saw is not super high powered, so it will stall actually before it kicks back if you maintain control of the piece, usually if the piece is big enough. So I can actually stop the saw, and then I'll reach down and turn it off, and then I'll reposition my work. Usually if it's pinching together, just by starting the cut again will clear enough of the curve. And then if you cut in a little bit further and you find that it's starting to pinch again, take it back out and make the cut again until you're at the point where it's not pinching anymore. I'm going to try again with this older piece of hardwood here. This is from an old pallet, and it's hard maple. And it's kind of wavy, and that's another thing. If you want to avoid kickback or pinching or distortion in your lumber, look for the clearest possible piece that you can find. A piece that has very few knots and nice straight grain will usually move a lot less than one that has a lot of figure and knots and stuff like that. So I'm going to run this through in one pass and see how this works. Once again, not a problem with pinching or anything like that. That is another important thing to note about lumber in general. The longer you leave it around to season, to dry out, the better behaved it will be when you go to cut it. Usually after when the tree is first cut down and then milled into boards, what they normally do is they put it in a kiln, which rapidly removes the moisture from it. And when it does that, it sets up incredible stresses inside the wood, especially if there are defects like knots and curly grain and whatever. So to relieve that stress, that will happen over time. I mean, this is why air-dried lumber is generally considered better quality than kiln-dried, because that stress is allowed to leave the wood as it dries out. It's the passage of time that will stop that from happening. And I think that's what happened here. If I had got this right after I picked it up, it probably would have curled all over the place like a hockey stick.